Hello everyone, today we talk about the literary and didactical forms of the glossarists. We already have made a video on Irnerius from Bologna, and we have seen the massive revival in the study of Roman law in 12th century Italy as the major juridical accomplishment in the medieval times that eventually spread in many other countries as fundamentally the Bolognese school of law, right, and the university maintaining the centrality in Europe, just like Paris maintained one for theology, but essentially becoming a point of reference that would start being contested, as we've seen also with the video on the Littera Florentina and also on the Mos Gallicus, so the history of Roman law in France, however, at the end of the Middle Ages in the early modern age. So today we concentrate essentially on the method of teaching, right, and that Irnerius and his followers began, right. That was characterized, in fact, by the gloss. So this annotations that were inserted in the Libri Legales, so in this collection of Roman law, the Theodosian Codex, eventually re-systematized by Justinian, that had come back fundamentally in the West, starting from this important urban centers of the Italian peninsula, and were a great deal, not just of juridical activity that had triggered the whole thing, but also new philological efforts had been down to reconcile, especially as we will see now, the pre-existing codes, the pre-existing, say, better laws that were applied, locally speaking. Actually, today we will not speak specifically of this. We already made some videos about the jus commune and what this meant, historically speaking, in medieval Europe. But this is also an important concept. We have to realize that the Roman law wasn't revived in the 12th century in Western Europe because of, let's say, the dogmatic ideal that stood eventually, behind the doctrine as it was formed essentially since the 14th century, right, and would remain somewhat rigidly, but not enough, over the years, maintained. But at this time, it was rather the necessity, essentially, to fill the gaps of the pre-existing legal systems with what appeared with naturally as more advanced juridical system than the pre-existing laws that were, however, fairly advanced, as we were saying before, and as we've seen in other videos, this melange, especially of the Italic kingdom, that was the place where this revival occurred, consisted in the Longobardic and the Frankish and the feudal and other even local rights, that laws that had essentially intertwined each other and that had triggered the same recovery of Roman law, because they had become a very complex and useful system, right? It's very important that the Roman law was not taken out of the blue back in the West where there was nothing else, right? The juridical science was becoming very, very advanced, also in these areas, and it's exactly this relation of affiliation that always happens, right? It's not the thing that creates the fertile ground, but it's the other way around, rather. Especially in this context, it's pretty evident. But anyhow, so as we've seen, the contribute of Irnerius was that essentially recollected, reintegrated properly the gestum, especially, and so the bulk, the most practiced part of Roman law in this regard, and from which eventually all the other scholars began to did their work of also perfection of the gloss, right, of this continuous commentary, exegesis of the legal text, hadn't limited himself, in fact, already at the time, to reconstruct the integral texts of the Justinian collection, right? Irnerius began properly the scientific teaching of law, right? A revival that put an end to the relative marginality in which the topic, the subject, had found itself in the the educational system of the time, which essentially contemplated just the school of liberal arts, right? So with another categorization. So this begins. It's very important because these universities that start exactly from this point, Bologna being the first actually in Europe, is the fact that they are devoted to law, completely to law. I mean, in Bologna they didn't teach anything else. The studium was born for studying law, right? And this is a huge deal because it wasn't framed in fact, just a generic and or general kind of universal teaching. This was aimed exactly at forming people who knew about legal stuff that could applicate that in real life. You hear the Italian peninsula is blooming with all these massive trades and transactions, and therefore people just need to regulate their lives in a different way, right? That's if you wonder why it happened there. So there was a very practical aim to this, and the creation of universities, we don't know much about the very beginnings, but it was a very spontaneous thing, right? It's not that they built a university, that they put professors in. I mean, these were autonomous communities that had formed literally among privates that went out there, and we know even in fields of grass, sitting there, and this guy teaching, and the other paying him. And the whole thing had developed accordingly, with hiring larger locals and eventually associating themselves as a sort of corporation, and that's how the thing began. With Irnerius and his pupils, law affirmed itself as a self-standing matter, right? It was distinguished from the others and founded specifically on the exegesis of the Libri Legales, right? On the law books, as they were called, the one of the reconstructed Roman law. And with Irnerius was also imposed in medieval culture juridical science proper, as the consequence, as the fruit of reflections that were elaborated over the Justinian texts by masters, as we have seen. And this consequence brought naturally to the perpetration, to the continuation, the passing down of this knowledge, of these reflections, exactly in the school or in the studium, where when it was transmitted to all those who wanted to learn actually these methods, sometimes just even of reading, right? Because the law is also something you need, as we've seen, readily available and readily interpretable, right? And naturally, because of this, also formal techniques and rational categories for the correct interpretation of the juridical system as such. Now, the exegesis of the Libri Legales and the teaching of such lectures presented themselves, starting from Irnerius, as two moments of the same activity, right? And it's pretty much obvious, right? You can't applicate such a soundly developed system like Roman law just by reading it. You have to study it. You have to understand this broader line that connects everything, especially considering that not just the Roman law back in the day had been composed under Theodosius with this ideal of Perpetua Sanctio that we will see a bit better later. So this idea that this was the law of the universal empire back in the day, right? So it had to remain eternal as much as the empire. And this naturally was, however, also a realization that existed in the Middle Ages, as we've seen in a much less dogmatic way, especially at the beginning of this, the university experience, like in this 12th century, but still framed in a world where there was technically a Roman Empire, because if you had asked the average Italian or German or Burgundian or Bohemian that lived within, in fact, the lands of the Holy Roman Empires, they would say, we are in the Roman Empire, right? And this was a bit, naturally, obviously more complicated, also because paradoxically, as we've seen, the revival of Roman law was spontaneous and related actually to, it was actually importantly tied also to the clash for investitures, but it was rather the Holy Roman Emperors that later came to access it from the cities that had already developed on their own, and paying for essentially, disposing of it, of these scholars, of these teachers. As we have seen specifically on the video about Irnerius and the Libri Legalis, it's been underlined by the recent studies how the literary forms and logical categories adopted by the same Irnerius in the reading of the Libri Legalis were already spread among theologians. That is, in this great clash between, as we've seen, the clash for investitures, and these ecclesiastical schools were also laymen, essentially went to study about liberal arts, and getting also acquainted in part, even to some juridical notion that the same ecclesiastics had, right, already before this development. The same Irnerius has been hypothetically thought to have been a clergyman himself, but it doesn't seem the case. But we know about the proximity of this thinking, right? However, we realize, and exactly for this reason, that Irnerius himself made law acquiring a distinct identity, right, detaching neatly from rhetorics, right, to which it had been relegated in the High Middle Ages, right. It had been rhetoric that had fundamentally monopolized the juridical abilities, just to say you must know how to argue and convince, right. That's an important part, naturally, of also juridical activity. But, as we've seen, there wasn't quite a juridical science per se out there. And there was, after Irnerius, definitely also a great development of the interpretative and didactic activities, right, that really followed him, in almost immediately, right, and it was amazing in scale, right, because since the beginning of the 12th century, Bologna was crowded with this growing number of students that were wishing to listen the word of the masters and essentially availing themselves of their teaching. So the principal literary form of the school inaugurated by Irnerius was the glossa, right? So this brief annotation composed and written in order to explain a text, right? But also its own terms and in its exterior dress, we can say, as much as in the spirit and that animates it, and in the principles that inspired it. So the gloss, as we know, was a literary genre that was in use already in the early Middle Ages, and that had been usually placed by the interpreter among the lines of the commented text, and therefore it was known as glossa interlineare, right? Or to the margin of the same, which was named in case glossa marginale, right? So interlinear or marginal, fundamentally. And from this literary form, let's say that the school of law inaugurated by Irnerius took the name of School of the Glossarists, because that was the main mean, aside from teaching itself, of actually making a point about this law. And compared, however, to the traditional gloss, the one of the Bolognese lawyers was especially the marginal one that is distinguished for the particular depth of the interpretation, but also for the very frequent reference to the parallel passages, the annotation that is of other passages of the Libri Legalis that discipline the same subject of the commented of passage. And this is very important because naturally you can banally write much less interlinearly than marginally speaking. So you see even, in typical manuscript, you often see this entire pages in which easily the gloss is larger, is even thicker and more extended than the same text, right? So there is a great reasoning, there is a great exegesis and thought to develop this. And especially this, which is a natural consequence of it, this awareness naturally of the correspondences that existed, in the Roman institutions in various cases within the same Libri Legalis, right? So that you could understand better naturally one passage by confronting it, by comparing it to another. Therefore, the interpreter usually compared different norms. He emphasized the concord, right? When they disposed, like they were disposed in a sort of identical manner, and it researched kind of a conciliation to reconcile it in case of contrast. And the reference to the parallel passages therefore appears of great meaning, right? Like the one that witnesses, from one side, the extraordinary mastery, right, competence of the Libri Legalis that was owned by the Bolognese jurists, right? But from the other as well, also the unitary vision of the Justinian law, right? That started taking this this phase that is basically not accepting the contradictions within it, right, or gaps that, however, did exist, as we have seen in the video about the Littera Florentina, and that in this phase, however, wanted to mainly to emphasize the harmony and the organicity, let's say, of the norms themselves. This is very important because it's a spirit that naturally starts since the beginning to stress the correctness, somewhat the perfection of this whole system, right? Albeit it was incomplete yet, because not the whole Justinian code was recomposed, but also there were certain textual mistakes, etc. Yet, naturally, the thing worked pretty well on its own, and you must think in a 12th century mindset, of course, how important such work had been, how much enthusiasm, right, it had had animated these lawyers, and how they had managed to reconstruct what had been forgotten in Western Europe. It never seen since centuries something so complex, and that could now come to discipline a society that had come back to be as complex as the ancient one. And it's through the joint and unitary reading of the text that the jurists obtained not only to the explanation of the meaning of the single passages or the single dispositions, but also in spotting the juridical categories that were defined by the Roman jurisprudence and legislation, in order to frame within the very varied praxis that was enforced at the time, and to found on them through original creative interpretation new theoretical categories that were adequated to the contemporary reality, right? So there is also a great work, as we will see now, that we have hinted at before, that is how to reconcile the system naturally with the reality of juridical or legal practice in real life, right? This thing was not definitely born as detached from the rest of society. It was not born as an elitistic thing for just aristocratic minds. No, these are lay schools. They teach stuff for whoever wants to learn. And if you look even the social composition of certain areas of Italy, for example, at this time, the figure of the notary, right? So he had to validate transactions, etc., both in public office and private one, was very high, right? There were entire areas like the Val di Nievole, for example, close to Florence, that like had, I don't know, 40% of the families were notaries. Like, that's impressive. So these people really made a living with this stuff, right? And this explains also how much law was tied to the reality of life. So different from parallel passages were also the so-called authentice, right? There were summaries or extracts of passages of the Authenticum, right, that Irnerius and the other glossarists had inserted in the margins of the Codex manuscripts in order to show the reader the content of a more recent constitution compared to the one, presented by the text. So differently from the parallel passages, they didn't propose to spot a kind of a harmonic and unitary solution to the discipline, but just to make people aware about a more recent regulation compared to the constitution inserted in the codex, offering essentially an essential offering of the same, an essential text, right? So once again, a connection with the legal practice of the time. So the interpretation of the Libri Legales from the side of the glossarists was also closely related to didactic activity that they carried out, right? The jurists composed their own glosses for the studium as such, right? Because in their lessons, right, they developed basically the same backbone of their juridical thinking. Right, everything was much less categorized at the beginning. It was just these people essentially spending a lifetime studying this stuff and getting their own impression and opinion. And you can imagine the complexity, right, of this. Like 12th century Europe was starting really to build this kind of scientific thinking these years in a much more robust way in the previous centuries, and this thing was known and far ahead, and therefore there was all a sensitivity, a critical skill attached to the analysis of a work that, as we've seen, wasn't just a work in itself, but also how you could reconcile it internally, in the case of passages that were not matching, but also with the more importantly with the reality. So you can imagine a lot of intersections. For example, at the political level, right? What is that this passage actually means for our society? How should we interpret it? How should we fundamentally see our society through the Libri Legales themselves? And the same creation of the glosses were literally like the master writing them down at some point, right? That they could be written by the same master, or even by his pupils that eventually followed his lessons, right? Much of this was also largely oral, in fact, as we've seen, like the proper moment of the creation of these glosses. So in the first case, where it was the master writing them, they were known as glosse redacte, right? So the written gloss that usually brought, in fact, the acronym of the name of the jurist, right? The initials often. And the second case, instead, there were the glosse reportate, so the referred glosses, for which the writer remembers the author that used them, and using the Latin preposition secundum, that is according to, right, this scholar, right? So the glossed manuscripts that have passed down up to us present certain aspects that are also important to clarify. First of all, we should remember that they are not, unfortunately, the originals used by the masters themselves, right? They are substantially the consequence of much later redactions carried out by scribes, by the way, Wu might have surely introduced changes compared to the original at every level. Like it could have been someone who just wanted to, to flip completely the meaning on purpose for whichever reason, or maybe just describe that, wrote something. Let's put it in this way. But in any case, the bigger deal here is that there was a whole community that worked around the stuff, that debated about it, and therefore it's never in any case the thought, the opinion from the spring of the jurist's mind. It also happened frequently that more masters, more teachers availed themselves of the same manuscript, and that therefore to the text of the first master there was, as we've seen, indicated by his own acronym, were added words or phrases of later masters, right, with other acronyms. And in fact, sometimes in the copies of the original that were produced by the scribes, happened that the original acronym was actually lost, with the consequence to lose what we would care, like philologically more, and even historically in general more about, that is the opinions of the older masters, of the founders, right? It was an enormous pride and tradition behind this thing. Jurists rose to levels of knighthood, right? In the Italian communes, these people were so powerful and so revered for their knowledge and their education that they were knighted, right? They were considered as important as knights, and they were really like it because their opinions were very heavy. They had a very specific weight, and they made the city earning a lot of money because people went there simply, renting rooms and, eating and leaving the city, and made the fortune of such centers. Think about the, all the mediation that happened throughout all this past, right? We have simply, essentially, several layers of glosses, the articulation of which philologically is not clearly reconstructible, right? It's very, very difficult to realize where such ideas came from, who added them, right? And from the layers of glosses, however, we also distinguish the so-called reticulum, that is basically this group of glosses that weren't ordered, right? So that they were noted, for example, randomly, literally. Like, think about all the people that literally came up with an intuition and wrote it down, right? And then someone else who got the manuscript simply copied it or integrated it, right? And maybe there was no continuity in this sense because every person added its own note, his own gloss, and there was no necessarily a direct link between them. So there was this natural succession of annotations carried out by a professor in an originary way, or even on the base of this other reticula. So literally these were webs, right? It's fascinating, even if you look at it in perspective of modern technology. So they could be in turn, like the glosses themselves, either redacti or reportati on the base of, depending on whether they were written by the masters or by his pupils. They could also be didactici, right, that basically reproduce partially a course of lesson. Graphici, right, that were essentially designed to frame several of these webs together in this apparatus of glosses, right? So that more properly is in turn also the result of an order that a jurist assigned to certain specific glosses that were written also ex novo for the occasion, or also selected among the pre-existing ones on the margins or interlineum of the manuscripts that were already used in the schools or for private study. Because that's the point, that all this glosses became an apparatus that eventually was studied as such. Here we are still in the early days, but eventually these glosses became entire works that were as important as the same Libri Legales as such, because basically they became a way of interpreting the Libri Legales, and naturally there were even, think about Bartolo from Sassoferrato, it became the greatest in this field, and so much that there was the saying that basically if you were not a Bartolist, as it was after the guy, you couldn't be a jurist even, right? So that came a moment in which naturally this whole thing was much more developed at the time of Irnerius and his immediate followers, but it was taking place rapidly and amazingly for those time standards. So it's basically all these glosses put together that in a regular and interrupted way explained the text, right? So that when you studied this stuff, you had the text and then the comment on it, and it went on throughout all the whole work, right? And the apparati instead weren't immediate, right? It seems that the first ones who tried were Azzone, to specifically within the Libri Legales in the Codex, and to the Digesta and the Institutiones, and also Ugolino de Presbyteri. So, as you realized, there is a deep connection between the interpretation and the didactic proper that characterizes the same literary forms used by the glossarists. Basically, have been spotted two major branches of this teaching, right? From one side, the exegetic one, and from the other, the, let's say, systematically expositive one. Let's call it in this way. So to the first branch, to the exegetic one, were assigned, together with the glosses, the lecture, right? So these were the lessons properly. That the classes that collected the classes, in fact, of lessons, they were given by the master, and that could be, therefore, even in this case, redacte or reportate, right? Then there were the repetitiones, right? The repetitions, right? This extra, teaching that was provided by the scholars outside of the ordinary classes. Then there were the commenta that were naturally the comment that researched the sense of the examined norm. Then the casus, right? There were lists of points, of questions presented by the same students about the issue, the subject, excuse me. And to the exegetic branch belong also the literary forms that had been expressed within the dialectical mode based on the oppositio of the contraria, right? So the opposition of the unmatching elements, from which was born the so-called practice of the distinguere, that is the distinction. So the distinctiones that came out of this activity, that derived straight from the dialectical method, the quare, that instead counterposed two norms, right, that were apparently, at least, in contradiction, in trying to harmonize them, of course, and then the questiones, right, so the comparison of divergent interpretations around about a theoretical problem. There could be, I don't know, questiones juris legittime nominis, right, etc., or to a concrete matter, like the questiones ex facto emergentes, right? So the facti de facto, which all mean essentially, what do we do when in a transaction, in a contract, whatever, this happened? How do we, how would we respond to this, right? So that, as we were explaining before, this is all connected to how do I do law practically, how I apply it. And then there were also the dissensiones dominorum, right? There were collections of counterposed opinions, properly, and of the Brocarda, that also spotted general principles of a specific subject, right? And all of these naturally reflect this continuous, it's not just about studying the text as such, or directly as such, but passing through this critical moment, right, of inquiry, of reflection. That also produced original interpretations that, once again, were not detached from reality. They weren't built on a text, as the later humanists criticized, because this text was wrong, but because actually the humanistic currents, even though they were somewhat more proper, of course, from a philological point of view, but still they didn't have the same level of pragmatism that such the Bolognese school still at that time owned, right? So the idea that we made all of this not just because it's Roman law and we want to be saint for size, but because we can't make it work for real in real society. Then, as we've seen, there is this systematic and expositive branch, right, to which can be attributed the summae titulorum, right? There was the order exposition of the titles of the Libri Legales that were relative to one subject. The summule, right? There was an expression of the analysis of a specific topic, and especially summe, right? Instead the more systematic and complete treatise of one of the collections inserted in the Libri Legales. And these expressions were, very personal, continuous, and elaborated, also literally and stylistically defined exposition built on certain precise, logical and formal architecture, we can say, that sometimes also came straight from the reading of certain classical works about law, especially about Cicero, right? So, once again, as we were saying before, even before the Libri Legales, of course, there was some idea of what also a text could be analyzed, a juridical text could be analyzed like, right? Read Cicero and see how he dealt with certain specific, legal matters, right? Which witnesses definitely also a pre-existing attention to to Roman law proper through the literary sources, not from the strictly legal ones. And these the second branch, it was a literary genre that emerged, or at least matured better, right after the mid-12th century, and it was dedicated especially to the Codex, but also to the Institutiones, to the Authenticum, to the Libri Feudorum, right? So even to the non-Roman law as such, so the other existing laws that existed before and that had been collected in these treatises that contained Longobard, Frankish, feudal law, right, and all together, and to the same digestum, right? Then there were also the Tractatus that were also systematic treatises, but differently from the Summe, they weren't about a collection, but about a specific topic, a specific theme. So freely, like standing as a more independent reflection and abstract, also theoretical question. And finally, there are also to remember other literary genres that even are kind of blurred between the exegetic and expositive slash systematic one. For example, the Tractatus Distinctionum, that were collections of distinctiones of more masters, right? And the Summae Questionum, that were systematic collections of questiones of more jurists. So, the Glossarist school, started by Irnerius, was concluded substantially with Accursius. There was an author during the third and fourth decade of the 13th century of this vast, really vast apparatus to the Libri Legalis, that for this reason was known as Magna Glossa or Glossa Ordinaria or Glossa Accursiana. So to stress not just the author's importance, but also the greatness of the same. And this was really a great work, for real. Accursius basically studied all the glosses that were really many at the beginning of the 13th century, that had accumulated from the 12th, and he selected the glosses that, according to him, expressed the best way of thinking of the masters and of a more correct interpretation of the Justinian texts. And he also composed in probably in two different moments, we're not really sure about this, a greatly extended text, right? It was formed by 96,000 glosses. You have understood well, right? And these glosses weren't just short, right? Just for the record. So according to, just think about what this means, right? Intellectually speaking, you're not even just think about the motivation, right? Even if there were naturally glory and fame and money and career about this, you really are making your entire life, your entire mind about this stuff, so that you don't know just by heart the Libri Legalis, but you basically study for a lifetime all the comments that have been made to it, which is in turn, an evidence, right, of the plurality of thinking that existed around this text at the time, so that eventually works like the Accursian one and one of others, as we mentioned before, would become also this necessary moment of, let's recollect the whole thing, like, who is right here? This is a great problem, because the more interpretations there are, in law, it doesn't work quite well with that. Unless, like, given a single object, like the law itself. But there was also the necessity to give a univocal order, let's say, to these interpretations, at least that is to say, let's separate the wheat from chaff, and let's do something that works, so that people, just without reading all the other glossarists, could read Accursius, like in this case, and then simply following him. And according to some historians, Accursius' work was also based on the work of John Bassianus, and eventually it was also continued by XII, right? So it was, even in here, naturally a very long, a very composite work that was matured even after Accursius' work himself. Between Irnerius and Accursius, there was quite of a time, right? And therefore, some generations of masters. Kantorowicz, in 1939, counted 4 of them. So think even about how society changed in the meanwhile, and this definitely for medieval standards were times and places of great transformations. So this partly explains also why these texts were so much commented, because society was really changing a lot, and there were very different views about what it would become and what would be. So you can imagine all the resistances and so on. So according to Kantorowicz, to the first generation belonged, of course, Irnerius himself and his direct pupils. There were Bulgars, Martinus Gosia, Hag, and Jacobus, and the so-called that were known as the Four Doctors, because of their authority. They were active up to the 60s and the 70s of the 12th century. There were also other figures like Cyprianus Vacarius, right? The latter especially attempted to export in England the Bolognese teaching in order to facilitate the spread of the juridical texts, and he also composed the Liber Pauperum. It was a collection of passages of the Libri Legalis that was destined to the poorest student, right? And the most mature phase of the school is represented by the 3rd generation, to which belong masters like Piacentinus, Rogerius, and Burgundio from Pisa. The latter being, by the way, one of the few speakers, the few people who knew Greek, right, at the time, which was precious, of course, because a great deal of this work was also carried out through Greek manuscripts, and that was very, very, very rare, right? Already by the mid-14th century, it was very rare to find someone who knew how to read Greek proficiently. Then there was Enricus de Ballium, Albericus de Porta Ravennate, Bencivenne from Siena, and John Bassianus, that we mentioned before in connection to the same Accursius, Azzone, Pilius de Medicina, right? While the last generation flourished in the first decades of the 13th century. And among these there are very famous names such as Ugolinus the Presbytery, Jacobus d'Ardizzone, Jacobus Colombi, Jacobus Baldovini, Refredus from Benevent, Carlo di Tocco, and Accursius himself. So on many occasions, and as we were hinting at before, we also remember about the famous Perpetua Sanctio, right? The idea that Theodosius and Justinian had about the divine will, essentially, that stood behind the same law, and the empire, such in its order, was symbolized by it. And as we have seen before, the glossarists received this, but they also preferred fundamentally the application. That was their only interest, and that would their prevalent interest, and would remain, in spite of all. That was the practical application, right? In their own times of the law. And that had to be in legitimate force in this regard, not only because the Digestum, as we know, witnessed the contribution of Roman jurisprudence to the work of conferring order to the multiplicity of the praxis, right? So framing it within theoretical and rational categories, so granting it, allowing an homogeneous reading of the most concrete cases by providing them a coherent discipline, So it's normal that even though this work was built with the, originally with the intent of essentially creating a stable, permanent, and changeable system, it still had within itself this kind of Roman pragmatic aspect of the story, that it has to give an order that is also practical, so that you can frame every situation, every juridical case within one specific discipline category, and therefore disciplining it accordingly. And within such categories, Roman jurisprudence had eventually spotted the many conditions in which the subjects that were parts in the juridical relation could find themselves, and of these subjective situations had also offered juridical solutions, over which the judges could base themselves for the solution of the controversies that were that underwent their exam. The imperial legislation collected in the Codex followed basically the same setting of the jurisprudence, and it was directed in fact to order in a rational way the multiplicity of cases of practice and the complexity of the personal situations as well. So the glossarists didn't they recognized themselves as direct heirs of the Roman jurisprudence, right? They were thinking exactly and understanding in this sense very subtly that they had to prosecute the interpretative activity tied to the living reality of society, right? This is very deep, because it really makes you understand what medieval civilization has been about. It was not a passive copy of the ancient past. This is not medieval, right? This is much more Renaissance than that. These people didn't care so much that this was the great authority. They cared so much about the fact that it was an important text that had the specific aim, but they were open to understanding what paradoxically the same originality of the Roman law was about, right, in historical perspective, that they still didn't understand because they didn't have the historiographical or philological means to know it by the time. But it's remarkable that these medieval jurists saw in the Justinian text a sort of web, as we've seen before, within which could be captured every moment of the contemporary practice. And because this latter one was under the the most different aspects different from the reality that the Roman jurists had disciplined, the glossarists committed themselves in interpreting in a creative way the Justinian reforms in order to formulate on the base of the latter theoretical categories and new rules to essentially put next to the Roman one that were considered, however, still fully valid, right? So this is really remarkable, right? That there is no, let's say, saying this is different. We need to cope with that. Either devalidate it or sacrifice this past vision on our own. No, this is not what the medieval civilization does. They basically managed to fuse them in one, right? To melt them in one and to make it work for real. Because great parts of Europe were disciplined by this, and it worked, and were incidentally the most advanced parts of Europe at the time, by the way. So consider this point. I mean, this anti-dogmatic thinking of saying, okay, we as a civilization, we're not better or worse than who came before. We are just doing something now that works to make society function better. This is medieval civilization. Not darkness, not backwardness, not people that had to copy the Roman past because they couldn't make it their own. These are delusions. Look at what these people did. This is the 12th century, right? It's not like the Renaissance. And we would be surprised, in fact, probably also how much, you know, we the more back we go in time, the least the less we know, right? But how probably even before the recovery of and we know it from the Libri Feodorum, for example, how sophisticated was legal practice, right, in early medieval times. And so the new juridical science of this period made its own the ordinatory framing of Roman jurisprudence. That is, in the first place, this varied and composite set of cases matured within the medieval practice was inserted within the classifications defined by Roman jurisprudence and witnessed by the Justinian system, right, as such. And thanks to this insertion in the concrete case was participating to the auctoritas. This is important at an ideological level. It was recognized to that law itself, and therefore it was legitimated as source of rights and duties as such. At the same time, its discipline was defined by customs was to conjugate with the one of the Justinian texts, and the new interpretation was founded on the same that had defined for the category the case within the same case in which it was included, right? So this is important because by inserting the new cases in the various Roman categories, this law now acquired its own authority, right? So you understand also why this business was so important, because naturally, the thing is a bit more complicated how effectively this law was applied, but the idea was still that there was, after all, a continuity in the Romanity and also in the public nature of such of such laws, right? So think about the depth of thinking. As we were saying before, here the Roman Empire had never died in their minds, so they were probably not even posing themselves the question of whether there had been a pastime, but that was for them naturally what the empire was about. This was done in the 12th century, still within universal thinking, after all. So it's perfectly matching. Also, the glossarists believed that from the Justinian law could be drawn the discipline of every juridically relevant case, right? Even of those that from socio-economical reality in fast transformation did not know a definite, let's say, framing from the side of the local customs, right? This is very important because it's a new way also of making law, right? Of producing it, of saying, these local customs are, let's say, built on the base of of tradition and stuff. But if you could frame an aspect that escaped them within Roman law, right? So as something, a case that was appearing there locally for the first time because society was changing in that regard, you could make it law if you made it to work within one of the categories of the Roman law, the Justinian code. So the doctrine basically suggested that in the case of certain gaps in the local customs, you could recur naturally to the Justinian norms first, that were considered valid for the juridical reality of every temporal moment, right? Because this is also the approach. It was healthier. It was not an impositive one, right? The Justinian code was not to substitute ipso facto the local customs. It was born, as we've seen originally, just to integrate it, right? And these local societies were working well their own way. But the important thing is that aside from the realization that you could still employ Roman law for expanding, in those areas where there was no clear discipline of these cases, you could also add the reading through the glosses of such norm as it was proposed. So it was also a critical application of the same. So Roman law wasn't taken as, in spite of the authority was recognized, so it wasn't taken passively again. It was studied, and there were, there was a huge intellectual commitment in reconciling it with practice for this very reason, that it wasn't an imposition. It was a way to make things work in real life. Also, the glossarists didn't limit themselves to a mere updating of the Justinian discipline, but they persecuted, as we've seen, in the interpretation of Roman jurisprudence, realizing naturally that even if this stuff was still valid, there had been changes over time, right? So this is another important realization. It's not that these people took the Roman law as valid simply because they thought that no time had changed. They took it as such because they recognized its authority. It was still mediated, and therefore, in part of this mediation happened through the realization that there had been changes, right, at a social, a productive, cultural level. So in this, it's probably where the medieval element also, or let's say at least what this whole elaboration was intervening the most, because in reading the law and glosses, the glossarists inspired themselves to dialectical method that they imported from the studying of theology and of philosophy, right? So for which the meaning of a text was, achieved through a series of arguments pro et contra, right? So for the proposed interpretation. Also, this means that there is a subtle critical inquiry, because, as we were saying before, there were also interests relative to a specific interpretation on another one, right? Stressing one instead of another implied that you had a different view, that this thing could make a difference in court, right? So it was a big deal for them. But this brought also, exactly for the vivacity of this kind of dialectical and argumentative method, to the creation of a highly a juridical science that had a very high creative value, and also a great relevance in originality, because it was capable of tying to the great Roman tradition and to detach itself from the same, thanks to the opening to the concrete needs of the contemporary society, and this was valid both for the new forms and the new contents that were being developed at the time. And we can make some examples of the originality of such thinking of the glossators. For example, in contractual matters, Roman law attributed, tying, strength to these, the only negotiable acts that were expressed in the nomina negoti, right? that were, defined very rigidly, while it denied it for agreements that had been concluded out of such forms. So agreements that it defined as kind of naked pacts because they weren't defendable in a judiciary way. We know that in early medieval times, things had been actually very dynamic and original and autonomous from this point of view. Basically, people made contracts whatever they cared, right? There were certain specific laws. Think about the Lombard one in Italy that was still in force in the Libri Feudorum part, that said, okay, if the Lombard law has this specific way of making contracts, but if two Longobards agree that they want to, make this contract according to another condition, let it be so, right? And even if they want to use let's say the Byzantine form of the Frankish form, if they're consensual, they're both consensual, let it happen, right? If we're not talking about all the different types of conditions, even if you can easily read in testaments, in donations, all this stuff, everything was very, very, very free, very dynamic. So medieval society by this time had created very different type of negotiable forms that, because of this, weren't contemplated immediately by the Roman categories, right? But that needed, even at the time, especially because they had been spontaneously developed, an adequate juridical frame in order to, to ensure stability and certainty about the relations that were born out of them. So the glossarists first, and the commentators eventually in a much more extended way, elaborated this original reading of the contractual forms of the Roman contractual forms. So in each of such forms, they spotted certain essential elements, right? The substantialia contractus, right? Distinguishing them from the ones that belong to the nature of the same deal, right? And that therefore, if they were not explicitly and formally listed, were part of it. So these were called the Naturalia contractus, right? And this also contemplated those, let's say, those elements that could even lack, but without, taking away the essence of the contract itself. So the accidentalia contractus, as they were called. So you understand what this means practically, is that there was a sort of bulk of core of conditions that dated back to the Roman, the category, and if this were not all in common to the various subcategories, right, they could also be essentially bypassed. The importance was that the core of the notion was still, of these essential, these common elements, was still respected in this regard. And such theorization had very important practical consequences, because the negotiable agreements that emerged from the practice could be therefore inserted in one of the Roman contractual nomina, even if they just respected the essential requisites, the substantialia contractus, right? And once that this insertion could have been available, the agreement in question was applicated. Let's say the entire regulation tied to the nature of the nomen of the contract, and together with the interpretation of this run, in that as it had been elaborated by doctrine, they were also extended. That is, the Naturalia contractus as such. But so even those elements that were somewhat new to the Roman category could pass and become constitutive in a way for further juridical cases. So the eventual presence of kind of random elements naturally enriched greatly the contractual discipline itself. The insertion of the transaction that was born from the practice of one of these Roman negotial forms allowed also doctrine to provide legitimate, let's say, interpretations to the single situations in which the parts of the transaction were to be. There were also other original interpretations. For example, a very important one concerning land assets that, as you know, were the most important. So in Roman law, the Dominium, that is the seigneury of the civis, of the citizen, over the res, over the asset, was disciplined in only one grade, and therefore it was distinguished by any other form of use of the land asset defined in the Jura in Re Aliena. Now, the early medieval custom, on the contrary, because of the influence of traditions of Germanic matrix, had matured plurality of degree of seigneury over the same land. Because there were essentially different levels of freedom, right? But this is not important now. But the meaningful aspect of this plurality was especially constituted at the time by the feudal benefit, right? The beneficium, the seigneury of which was recognized both to the lords that granted the beneficium, that to the vassals, the vassal that had gotten it. This is interesting because also feudal law had changed, was somewhat simpler to begin. But the revival of the studying of Justinian law posed at this point the glossarists in front of the necessity to reconcile the plurality of degrees of the estate seigneury of their time with the unicity of the Roman Dominium, right? So about this, in particular, John Bassianus formulated the doctrine of the split dominion, right? That basically recognized the applicability of the Roman discipline of the dominium both to the subject that de facto exercised the management of the land and of the communities that resided in it, right? That were attributed the dominium utile, right? And the one that integrated with his own authority the protection on the same, right? That was naturally the lord, who was considered the title holder of a dominium directum. There is a direct dominion, properly. And this is important because many seigneuries had been born actually without a formal, let's say, with a derivation of the seigneury from a public power. This is very important because in Roman law there was, everything was centralized in this regard. So the state disciplined the whole thing. Of course, there were local customary laws, but everything was framed within it. Feudal law didn't work like this at all, right? And things like the Dominium, for example, were what is the Dominium in the first place? It's not even. It's the seigneury proper, which is a different thing. It implies a contract within it already, because it contemplates the lordship as such, but also the rights of the beholder, like of those who aren't that land in the first place. So the thing was complex, and they resolved it pretty cleverly in this regard. So accepting was fundamentally a split control at two different levels on the same asset. But just to make you understand how this solution was original, right? They didn't copy it from the Roman one. They created it in their own, and it worked, and it justified the feudal beneficium as such, right? In the various degrees that were tied to owning all the land, etc. These are all just two of the main many examples that we could make about this topic. The interesting thing is, once again, how this all came spontaneously, right? This was not directed by a king or by an emperor. This stuff was created just because certain people needed to make their transactions, and they created on their own this very sophisticated and complex juridical system on the base of the same Roman law, but also of the existence of other laws that were next to it, and that as far as they worked well, they didn't even require Roman law. So naturally, the thing is kind of more blurred than it seems, but in the first place, the thing that this happened, right? In the first place, it's amazing, right? The Middle Ages here rock pretty badly, right? And this flexibility, especially of mindset, would remain after as a constitutive character, same Bolognese school, even when the thing somewhat crystallized on the base of the interpretation of some glossary systems, and as long as the attention was aimed at disciplining reality. Well, okay, for today we stop it here, and we will talk, of course, again about this stuff. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.